I'm Matt Gamble.
I'm Nels Anderson.
I'm Carla Zamanja.
And we are working on Generation Exile. Generation Exile is a sustainable solarpunk city builder with a reactive emergent narrative that changes every single time the game is played. You hit new game, you get a new story. You were aboard a generation ship traveling for several hundred years, leaving a ecologically ravaged Earth behind, attempting to find a new home for humanity, and you are basically having to start from almost nothing. So rather than repeat the failings of Earth in the past, you need to find a new way to develop a society that is sustainable and can thrive.
Your job is to make sure that you shepherd humanity successfully to the destination planet, and that they live to get there, and there's enough people to keep humanity going. There's so many ways you can screw that up.
Yeah, the core loop of the game on any particular given turn is the ship itself contains 4 distinct biomes, and when you start the game, you are in kind of a temperate Mediterranean-esque biome, but it's like teetering on the verge of ecological collapse. So your first immediate goal is to, develop the structures you need both to provide for your populace, but also begin to get the ecosystem to a point where over some period of time, it can regenerate itself. And by the time you reach planetfall, you should have kind of brought all of these ecosystems back into a sustainable, balanced state that is both providing for all the natural organisms in them, but also all the people. Players' goals in Generation Exile differ a bit from more traditional recognizable city builders. We're not making a 4X game. It's adjacent, because most people might not even know what those 4 X's are supposed to stand for, but it's like explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate? And when you really stop and think about it, those last 2 are like, uh-oh, but almost by accident, it does reflect a mindset that exists around us, where it's like, oh, well, when we need more resources, we can just keep extracting. We can just keep taking more forever. We can just keep growing and growing and growing. It's simply not possible to keep expanding forever. So instead, we want to anchor the city building strategy game stuff in about finding more ways to be more efficient, more effective, to use only what you have around you, because there's no external source of anything else.
Fundamentally, you're on a spaceship. You got what you got.
Or yes, you're still having to provide the basics for your society: food, shelter, clean water. But as you make your way through the game and progress through the game, rather than just infinitely getting bigger, it's about becoming more regenerative.
So we get to take inspiration from a lot of good, hard sci-fi.
There's a lot of appealing things in grounded, near future, more hard science fiction where the problems aren't solved by space magic or interdimensional demons or whatever. As cool as interdimensional demons are, to be clear, there's just more small, interesting details about things that actually exist in the world that we're then able to embody in the game. And aside from novels like those written by Kim Stanley Robinson, like Aurora, which literally takes place on a generation ship, or Ministry of the Future, there's also recently this fascinating board game that we all played very recently called Daybreak. Daybreak is all about directly addressing climate change, which isn't exactly what Generation Exile is about, but the similarity is it's drawing a lot of real world concepts in while still remaining a compelling, fun game just to play on its own.
Weirdly, one of my favorite things about strategy games when I play them is that you can learn a surprising amount of useful information just by playing it. What's saltpeter? What's a janissary? I wouldn't know those things if I hadn't played a game that involved them. And there's something really satisfying about learning real-world concepts. It's not necessarily a didactic game, but nevertheless, you know what that is now, and now you'll notice it when you see it in the world, which is very useful to us.
Yeah, now I know what an anaerobic lagoon is. That's very cool.
Son of a gun. You wanna know what an anaerobic lagoon is?
It's a big bog full of poop.
Yay.
But it's just leveraging things that exist in the world to be a little bit more specific and a little bit more interesting, and not just having, made up unobtainium whatever things, but stuff that's real, but still using that as the engine of like a compelling and engaging game that is a series of interesting decisions.
In a lot of future-oriented fiction, the future imagined is a little rough, little grimdark, little every man for himself, yeah. And when you think about it, it's hard to imagine how you could keep humanity going in that way for particularly long.
The thing that's appealing about solarpunk aesthetic is ultimately it's optimistic. There are still problems, there's still crises, there's still conflict, there's still disaster, but the way to address those challenges are in forms that are like inherently collaborative. We can survive and thrive if we earn it, but we're gonna earn it by working together.
You have to have some form of community in order to survive, period.
What we wanted to achieve is to take a relatively recognizable set of city building mechanics, but having more narrative and story elements there as well. Because the thing that is so rich about city builders is that they're so systems dense. There's just so much like game state in there. And that game state is all very much driven by the choices and decisions that the player is making. But the opportunity then we saw is to look at all that in the city building layer game state and then
drag it out into the narrative.
Exactly.
Kicking and screaming.
but in a good way.
In a good way.
And sometimes in a bad way.
Yes.
Exactly, where rather than, just like, everyone's gonna play through the game and at turn 15, this thing happens, then at turn 25, this thing happens. Instead, you can just have a big collection of authored narrative events that are reactive to whatever choices you've made. Like, weird ecology things that are occurring aboard the vessel, or
they're situational.
Various crises.
Yeah.
Small and large. I'm very proud of the work that our narrative team has done so far and we're continuing to do. They have experience working on titles like games of the Far Cry series and Baldur's Gate 3, and we're able to provide the player the ability to make consequential specific decisions that are divorced from just the pure mechanics and systems of the game.
And then also it goes the other way.
Exactly. The decisions you then make in the narrative events echo back into the city building, which then informs the events that will occur in the future so that the decisions you make do feel reactive, that like this playthrough is only happening to you. And we're trying to lean more into mechanics and systems around like adjacency, like, oh, because these three structures are adjacent to each other, they create this particular bonus.
Just a little bit of synergy right there.
Exactly, and then that not only is like useful and functional on the city building level, but then also create some condition for certain narrative events that are about the things that are happening here now, right? Because these set of buildings are infested or kind of eerie or whatever.
Our gameplay system is constantly paying attention to different tags and traits that exist in the game, whether that's on a tile or on a character or a action that has been performed by the player. So if a player has placed down a specific type of building, like a house, we may tag the system to say that a house has been built. We can either choose to potentially throw something onto the map or throw up a piece of UI or expose the house scene that we've built for you to go into and start a story event in. The story events will take place in some of these locations, and we think that's really interesting and compelling because it's not often that you get to go down into the cities that you're building in a game like this. And so the designers can tie certain narrative events to very specific bespoke things that may only pop up on 5% of a player's playthrough, that only a few people will see, versus some things that maybe are more common in the game and everything in between. So, and depending on the choices that you're making throughout the game, or just the dice roll that you got because certain traits exist in this map layout that didn't exist in the previous layout that you played, you'll experience a different series of narrative situations and choices that you have to make as a player.
Yeah, like if you are undersupplying shelter for people, we can also pull a narrative event that is one of these ones that's related to like social strife due to overcrowding, to make it a little bit more, personified.
The game gives players a forecast of the events that can occur.
And you can see, like, oh, at this point, the ecosystem is gonna completely collapse. And so as you are restoring things and building out the civilization, you can see those points of danger moving further and further away from the immediate present, which is good. But by anchoring that just right there in the game, there's kind of a inherent long-term view of what's going on. And because, you know, it's a generation ship, so it's this journey over hundreds of years, the things that happen in one particular moment can also have ramifications that you might not be able to see for like 20, 30, 50 years, when all of a sudden this thing that didn't seem like a big deal before all of a sudden becomes maybe a lot more of a pressing concern.
Connectivity between characters, individual stories, and the actual moment-to-moment gameplay is pretty closely linked. You have charge of these people, and you have charge of them for a long time. Everything that you choose to do impacts them and affects them. And sometimes they're not that happy with you because you do have limited resources and you have limited time, and you can't make everything perfect for everyone all at once. So you often have to make judicious choices towards what's most important that you think at that time.
In a traditional city builder, you would just sort of select a building, place it down somewhere, and that'll immediately occur. In Generation Exile, you're actually going to be using your crew and members from the ship and sending them out to perform these tasks for you, and their relationships may have some form of implication to benefit or potentially a complication that would happen during that task. And that can create some interesting potential seeds for our narrative engine to pay attention to as well.
So in the game, you are a specific individual person. You're not playing, a nameless like administrator or governor or whatever. Yeah, you like at the start of the game, you develop your character.
Yeah.
You set like their name and their background, their appearance, all that kind of stuff. So then the generative NPCs in the game can have opinions about you and the things that you have done.
Yep.
And then that itself can feed into future narrative events. There's one narrative event where there was, in the past, this big loss of life, a crowd crush situation, a bunch of people died. And then years later, all of a sudden, these strange plants that look kind of like fingers begin growing out of the ground. And by itself, it's just kind of like, okay, what do you do with this? How do you embrace it or not? But if there is an NPC who has previously had fixation on this weird annihilation-esque ecology, then actually they end up cast into that narrative event as someone who's been like taking samples in the night or whatever. And then the decision-making then becomes around, do we let them keep doing this on the hopes that they'll discover something interesting? Or do we like, oh no, we just need to burn all of this, or other spaces in between? But if there wasn't an NPC with traits like that, it would just draw an entirely different event or like a different variation of that event. The game terminates at planetfall, but at the end, there will be echoes of the decisions you've made along the way that provide like that final coda of what happens next. It should feel like the journey to get there is one that you uniquely experience, and the conditions that you finish with are ones that are reactive to all the decisions you made leading up to that point. The game can be wish-listed right now on Steam, and folks can also just go to solarpunk.com to sign up for our newsletter and learn more as we roll things out. There'll be more delicious tidbits in there.
Will they be delicious?
They'll be delicious.
How delicious?
Delectable. I love tidbits.
So do I.